Welcome to Grow Your Dreams podcast. I'm your host, Shaylin Fair, and I'm so glad you are either listening for the first time, welcome. And if you are listening in because you've been here before, hey, welcome back. I'm so glad that you've tuned in. So today I have a really important conversation with author, counselor, and pastor John Sparks, who has been working with people for the past 40 years using this amazing toolkit of understanding somebody's temperament, your own temperament, and the temperament of the person that you're engaging with. So temperament, in short, is a set of characteristics that we're all born with, and mine will differ to yours perhaps. We have an introverted temperament as well as an extrovert. We all have an introvert temperament. And in the introverted part of us, that deeper inner place, that's where we process our emotions and our thoughts and our deepest feelings. And if those things aren't processed and looked at and brought to the surface, then that can cause depression because we try to shove it down and we try to drive through life without looking at those deeper things that need to be looked at, because either because of our upbringing or we've never been shown how to look at our emotions. What we can end up doing is looking at that part of ourselves, that deeper part that feels, that sensitive part. We can perhaps start looking at that part of ourselves as something that is bad, something that needs to be avoided. When we do try avoid these things within us, situations that need to be processed, feelings that need to be understood, when those things are ignored, shoved away, or pushed down, then what can happen is it creates a buildup and an accumulation of these things underneath the surface. And we have breakdowns come from that, depression, anxiety, all sorts of implications of us as humans when we ignore those deeper parts of us, those important parts. We end up living at the surface and having issues in ourselves and in our relationships. So that's quite a long introduction. It's been such a insightful and enriching conversation with John over the past several episodes. If you're somebody who is currently wanting to understand anxiety, there is an episode of an anxiety, so do look through the podcast episodes. But today, as I've said before, we are looking at depression and particularly looking at the melancholic temperament, but we do talk about various different things as well, which you will find helpful. So enjoy the episode. I hope this helps you grow as it has helped me. Welcome back, John. It's good to have you.
It's good to be back, Shaylin. Thank you.
Good. So I would love to dive into depression and anxiety today, and to see how understanding our temperaments can help with these two aspects of life, depression and anxiety. So John, if you just want to dive in and just start to unpack, what does it look like in understanding depression in light of understanding your temperament?
Right, that's a good question, because I think understanding the melancholic temperament gives real insight into the nature of clinical depression. It might be worth saying that a melancholic can experience clinical depression. A phlegmatic, I tend to use a different word. I tend to talk about a phlegmatic collapse. That can sound a bit emotive, but there's nothing judgmental in using that term. And it's very easy to look at those two very different people and to just say, well, they're both depressed. And to a point, that's true. But if we're going to really understand the nature of this, I think it is helpful to separate them out. And in thinking of the melancholic here, I think we shall gain lots of insights into what is at the heart of depression.
Can I just stop you there? And just for listeners' sake who hasn't, listened to the previous episodes about the temperaments, we have two temperaments in most cases, an introvert and extrovert. Can you just describe in brief, what does that relationship look like?
Between the two temperaments, well, there are two extrovert temperaments. There's the sanguine and the choleric. There are two introvert temperaments. There's the melancholic and the phlegmatic. And when we think about one of the temperaments, the introvert temperaments, the melancholic, there are specific characteristics in there that make it very easy for that person, under certain circumstances, to go down the path towards depression. Just linking that to the extrovert, the person could have either the choleric on top, which, if you may have heard the earlier podcast, is the goal-getter. The sanguine, very personable, lovely personality. And if the person lives in either of those extrovert temperaments, it's possible there's still a process going on inside within the melancholic, possibly even unnoticed for some time. I've been in situations where a person will, well, I'm thinking of a young lady now who actually said to me when I asked her, when did you first become aware of your depression? She recounted a situation that she thought had caused the depression. And I was able to say to her, I think that depression was there for a long while. What that incident did was simply brought it right up to the surface, and you had to do something about it. So it's very easy when you've got the extrovert sitting on top to try and avoid it, to use the extrovert to compensate for what is going on in the melancholic in this case.
So why does the extrovert avoid what's going on underneath the surface?
Okay, very good question again. Let's paint a similar picture to what we did in one of the earlier podcasts to set the scene. The perfect environment for any of us to be brought up in, which actually doesn't exist, is with parents who so understand themselves and they're introverts that they understand us and that they enable us to be so secure that we can express anything in our introvert as well as in our extrovert, and know that at the very least either or both of our parents will really work hard to try and understand why we said that, why we felt that, and to help us process whatever it is that we're feeling in whichever introvert temperament we've got. Now, that's the ideal. It doesn't exist. So to that extent, we're all at different points, if you like, on this business of how secure we feel in our introvert. Now, if we don't feel comfortable in it, we're going to struggle to process the emotions that go on in there. Everything that happens to us, it registers. It produces an emotional response, whether we're aware of it or not.
So, sorry, John, again.
No, you carry on.
I'm very interested. What you say, being comfortable in your introvert.
Yes.
What does that look like or feel like?
Okay.
Are we? Yeah.
Let's say a child has gone up to their bed, end of the day. Perhaps mum or dad been up, said goodnight, and the child is just settling down. And as they're lying there trying to get off to sleep, perhaps an incident from school suddenly comes into their head. And this thought that they've managed to avoid for most of the day because they've just been getting on with the day, this thought begins to grow, and it puts them in touch with some quite powerful feelings, maybe of fear, maybe of worthlessness. And they've not looked at this during the day because they kind of just got on with life. But if they then go downstairs and say, Dad, I just can't sleep, and Dad has got enough sense to say, okay, come on, is there anything troubling you? The child then needs to be secure enough to say, well, my mate said this to me today, and Maybe he didn't mean anything by it, but I can't get it out of my head. Now, the dad at that point could say, oh, well, you shouldn't be thinking about stuff like that at this time of night. Back you go to bed, you'll be too exhausted in the morning. And that boy will go to bed in a muddle. Well, dad could be wise and say, come on, tell me what your friend said. Tell me what it is that you're worried about. And if the lad shares that, which you hope he will, then if dad takes that seriously and connects with it, maybe with something like, oh, I know exactly what you mean. I've had that happen to me, and it's a horrible feeling, isn't it? So I do understand. And then begins to paint the bigger picture to help the lad cope with it and get it in perspective and see that this stuff is all part of life. But what he's done is he's validated that emotion. He's therefore validated that part of who the child is, in this case, the melancholic. And he said, you're okay. There's nothing odd about you just because you felt that particular emotion. You're not stupid. And, that's a whole different feel that child will go to bed with that night, and he'll sleep.
Thank you for pressing play on the Grow Your Dreams podcast. Just like plants need water and sunlight to grow, I think in the same way, we need continual encouragement and inspiration on our own journeys of growth. Do stay connected and check out Grow Your Dreams podcast over on Instagram. And also for show notes, more inspiration and encouragement, check out shaylinfair.com. And so what happens if you've grown up and, it was the other case of saying, go back to bed, and then those feelings don't get looked at, then is that where the kind of the introvert starts to be ignored as you grow up?
Yes. And then it's a bit like the introvert has free rein with all the negatives. There's no check on the negatives.
Because there's no understanding and no one's ever connected and it's never been processed.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So every time an emotion comes up that the child doesn't know what to do with, there's only one route out of that, and that is to climb up into the extrovert. So I don't know if that makes sense when I use that.
It does. Yes, absolutely. No, thank you for that.
I visualize somebody with a little step ladder trying to live in their introvert and feeling everything that's going on and trying to express it, and then realizing nobody gets it and you're on your own. So pull this little step ladder out of the cupboard or wherever it is, lean it up against the side of the pit and just climb up into the extrovert and try and make life work there. And then you learn in life, don't go near the pit, because the pit has become synonymous with the introvert. And
then seen as a bad place, the introvert.
Absolutely. So that child obviously grows into a man, tries to establish adult relationships. The very part of him, i.e. the introvert that he needs to use in order to connect with somebody in a meaningful relationship, that is now equated with the pit that you must make sure you never fall into. And then we wonder why relationships start up and so quickly break down.
Okay, so now there's an older man who's possibly very melancholic in his introvert temperament and got severe depression. Where would we start with helping somebody like that?
Okay. Well, if we go back to the understanding of the melancholic, then it will be easier to get into his shoes. And there's one or two things that I can remind you of that are characteristics of the melancholic. We can view the temperaments and the way that they feel about themselves, or the way that they feel in order to have value, as being like at different points on the ladder. So if we think of, for example, the choleric has to be at the top of the ladder to feel they have any value. but the melancholic instinctively knows that they're at the bottom of the ladder. So to put it another way, they're just naturally negative about themselves. And that isn't of itself a bad thing if it's handled. It can make them wise, it can make them insightful, they're not taken in easily. In a way, that negativity can be part of a whole group of qualities. So it's not bad in itself, but, and this is where if the melancholic is neglected, it gets out of hand. It just naturally grows into, oh, well, that's just me, isn't it? And I would do that, wouldn't I? And it all becomes very, very negative. And that's important to understand with the melancholic. There is that instinctive self-blame. It's going to be my fault if something goes wrong. And they're very vulnerable to that. And if you link that with one of their qualities, the self-sacrificing, the giving of themselves quite naturally to others, that's partly because they actually think others better than them. But it's very easy to use that to then think it's always going to be them who's wrong. But the problem is this builds into a negative picture. And there's one other thing we need to say here to paint a clear picture. When we're born into this world, as little babies, obviously, we all have a question mark over us. And for the melancholic, the question is, what am I worth? Now, the phlegmatic has a slightly different question, and we'll come to that if we look at the subject of anxiety. But the melancholic, that's what they want to know. What am I worth? They instinctively feel that they're worth less than anybody else around them. And they need an answer to that question. Now, unless a positive answer is given in their developmental years, they will assume that they are not worth very much. And that's where the problems come in. So because this question of worth is key to the melancholic, you can imagine the scenario if this person wakes up one morning and maybe the question is unspoken, but it's a feeling. What am I worth? If I'm not worth very much, what's the point of getting out of bed? In fact, what in life is worthwhile? If I don't have value, if I don't really matter that much to anybody, now it may be that this child is very dearly loved. But if they haven't been connected with, the melancholic won't know that. So if the child and then teenager and adulthood and so on, if that question persists and that answer of not very much, then what is the point of it all? What's the point of even doing the ordinary things of life? And you can see how once you begin to feel that you're taking up space that somebody else should have, it's not that big a step to true depression and even, sadly, to thoughts of suicide. So this question of self-worth is absolutely central here, and it's the melancholic that is particularly prone to doubt their value. And unless during their developmental years a clear picture of their value is presented to them, unless that happens, they are going to be very vulnerable to depression in years to come.
So then how does somebody who's in that state, they've moved on from childhood and they're through their teenage years, how do they help themselves to grow out of depression or, so they don't keep falling back into that place of low self-worth?
Yes. Well, it may help if I answer a slightly different question, which you haven't asked, which then will help us apply the same principles to the question you have asked. So if we ask the question, what needs to happen to that youngster as he or she is growing up, then the answer, as we spoke earlier, is that somebody needs to connect with them. Because if there isn't a connection, within the melancholic, within the introvert, then what does the child feel? That they simply don't matter. It would be the equivalent of, say, you've got a bunch of children at school, a new child comes along, comes into the playground, obviously into one of the classes and so on, and nobody talks to them. That would be very unkind and quite ridiculous. But if you have that melancholic temperament and nobody's prepared to put the effort in to actually find out what it is you are really feeling and what it is you are trying to say, then it's like there's part of you walking through life that truly is worthless, because that would be the feeling of the child in the playground. Well, I obviously can't be worth very much because nobody's even bothered to come and ask me my name. That child would quickly have a problem if that wasn't addressed. I even, as part of one of the courses, tell a silly story about the family next door in which there is a child and nobody in the family talks to that child. I won't go into that now, but it's as powerful as that. There is, if we work on the basis of, like, as we said at the introductory podcast, there's two people living in one house. There are at least two temperaments in each of us. It's like parents and siblings and friends will address one of those people in the house, but totally ignore the other one. And if your starting point is, well, I'm not worth very much, then even just failing to make that connection simply reinforces that very negative message. So that's how it's formed in very simple terms, which then puts us in a position to say, well, what do we do about it if we suddenly, either find ourselves trying to help somebody who's struggling with depression, or if we're struggling with it ourselves, what can we do? I think it's worth saying you really need somebody to walk with you on this, because just going back to what we've said about how that depression forms, it's a lack of connection. So we want somebody to walk with us who will actually understand what it feels like to be a melancholic. And I think if you know that this issue of depression is your struggle, or somebody you know and love and you want to help, then you do need somebody who will really understand that side of who they really are. Because there's got to be a connection made. There's got to be the ability, as we said in the illustration of the child who's gone to bed and lies there all worried. I mean, you're desperately wanting your dad or your mum to say, yeah, I really understand what you have said there.
So if you... Sorry, John, again, just to interject there. So if it's, you talking to an adult friend who's struggling with depression and, they didn't have anyone connect with them as they were growing up and the introvert's been totally ignored, then how does it look in conversation with that person? Is it allowing... I'm trying to understand. I'm trying to understand what that conversation would look like.
Yeah. Well, the truth of it is, there's got to be trust established. Do you remember we said that the ideal home is where the child is free to be who he or she really is. And if you think about this in our relationships as a whole, I mean, we're talking in sort of ideal family pattern terms here, but let's say you've got two friends, or a man and woman living together in marriage where they're not able to have children. The wife, and obviously the husband as well, but we'll put it this way around, she wants to know that her husband understands her, not just half of her, not just the extrovert part that might have attracted him to her in the first place. She will want to be connected with. So let's say she's a melancholic, she'll want exactly that. She may not have had that connection in her childhood. She may come into marriage even feeling quite estranged within herself. It's up to the husband to provide a safe place where this woman can begin to share what she really feels, and that he can begin to identify with that, or even it's not that he'll understand everything. If he's not a melancholic himself, or if he doesn't live in his own melancholic, it might sound like nonsense that his wife is saying in that scenario. But if there is a heart to journey with his wife and to understand and even just begin to piece things together in his mind, think, well, that's funny, I've got a colleague at work who talks a bit like my wife. Maybe they're not both crazy. He needs to begin to open his heart to that, and might be worth my saying there's a lot of information on our website that people can be directed to, and sometimes to even just read a description, for example, of a melancholic. People have looked at that and thought, oh, maybe I'm not crazy after all. Maybe there is half the world's population out there with the same temperament as me. And that's amazingly reassuring and validating, and begins to give you a completely different perspective. So whether it's finding a friend, which is obviously the ideal, take a look at the website or write in, make contact, but start talking and in a way start taking start taking the whole of who you are seriously. And for the person who's trying to help, it's not a 5-minute fix. It's a journey.
Yes.
It's walking with that person, not in a patronizing way, but in an exploring life together way.
Yeah.
And if there's something that's said that you don't understand, you still take that person seriously and you think about it, and you really make sure. And as a Christian counselor, talk to the Lord about it even, and the understanding comes so that you are able to really bring a connection into that person's life where perhaps there hasn't been a connection up to that point in time.
Okay, John. So that's really helpful in how, somebody with depression can reach out and start having those really meaningful conversations and connecting at a depth. What can somebody do kind of in their own time and in their own mind and in their own thinking to help themselves grow out of depression?
Okay. That again gives me opportunity to say some really important things here. The bottom line in many of our lives, perhaps all our lives, is how we feel about ourselves. That's absolutely key. We've talked about the melancholic and how he or she can feel naturally very negative about themselves. If they've not been connected with, that's going to greatly increase that negativity towards themselves. The other thing that might be worth just throwing in here is, especially if a person has the choleric melancholic combination, there's a very good chance that the choleric could be quite critical of your own melancholic, and that can set up a self-condemnatory loop within the mind of the choleric melancholic. So that's an additional thought there. So I'm painting a scene here where you feel bad about yourself. If something goes wrong in life, well, it feels like that's kind of what you deserve. I've spoken with people that feel they're such a bad person that when something does go wrong, they kind of feel better because they just feel like they're getting what they deserve. So how on earth do you start to reverse that, as you say, even the person within themselves? This is a difficult thing to do, but this is what we need to aim at. We need to begin to open the door to the possibility that that horribly negative view that you have of yourself might just not be true. And I put it like that because it's probably too big a step to just suddenly throw a switch and say, oh, well, I'm not that awful person they all think I am. Because the problem is it's you who thinks you're that awful person. Yeah. Even if your extrovert tries to cover it deep down inside, there can be some very strong negative feelings against yourself. So you've got to begin to allow yourself to challenge whether the picture that you have, that you've grown up with of yourself, and especially if you can separate it out within that introvert part of you, whether that is really the whole story, whether it's true. In other words, just throw a question mark into this. So if you put the question mark in, next time somebody responds to you in a certain way, a look, a statement, whatever, and you feel that instinctive negative response within yourself, oh, well, that's just me, then instead of accepting it, saying, wait a minute, maybe that's not me, maybe that's a distorted picture of myself that has developed over the years. I'll give you a practical example. I remember a lady with the choleric, melancholic temperament actually saying, I raised the issue in this context that I've just described of how many times in a day she apologized for something. And that kind of showed a negative view because it was completely disproportionate. And I said, just become aware during today of the times when you apologize and you don't need to. And I spoke to her in the next day or so on the phone. And she said that was interesting. She said that day I was in the supermarket and a lady ran into my foot actually with her trolley. And she said, I apologized to her.
Yeah.
And that really rang a bell with her. And they're just little things. But the trouble is when that grows within you incrementally in those developmental years, you just don't notice them. It becomes part of you. And that's what I mean about begin to challenge that maybe that deep down fundamental negative feel that you have of yourself and of who you really are, however much you try and cover that up with the extrovert, maybe that just is not true. Another little practical thing, it's very easy to use self-denigrating humor. Oh, well, that's just me, isn't it? And come out with funny quips,
I've definitely had people do that to
That's
me.
right. Now,
Say, oh, yeah, I'm terrible, aren't I?
yes, that's right. Now, if somebody says that to me, I'll challenge it.
That's very good. I need to do that, definitely.
Yes. I know a lady visited me, and she had a leather jacket, actually, and she came through the door with this jacket on, and I offered to take it from her and hang it up on the coat peg, which was nearby. But before I could even finish offering, she'd put it on a chair near the entrance, near the doorway where she came in. And because it was leather, it slipped off this chair and went on the floor. So I said, look, come on, give it to me. He said, oh, no, that's all right. It's only my jacket. And that just told me volumes about what this lady felt about herself. It was her jacket. Anything associated with her wasn't going to be worth very much. If it ended up on the floor, so what? And there's just a host of little things. Now, if you're on your own with this, begin to try and just step back a little bit, hear yourself, try and see the feelings that run through you and the thoughts that run through your brain and begin to challenge them. What if you're not that horrible person that you've just accepted after all this time? What if you could do a rewind? And I'll sometimes say this to people. Imagine yourself as a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old maybe. I don't think people would have looked at you and thought, what a horrible child. But they may have seen perhaps either the circumstances you were brought up in or even the very best intentions from parents who loved you dearly, but actually couldn't connect. And that little child with such beautiful and wonderful potential got missed. And now you end up so heavy against yourself and such a horrible negative picture. That's not you. It never was you. But that's what you've been led to believe about yourself. So begin to challenge it, to question it. And another angle on this is when somebody pays you a compliment, don't just try and hurry the conversation along. Don't let the thought go through your head that says, you wouldn't say that if you knew who I really was. I remember being in conversation with somebody, and they were telling me how at work they were being offered some potential promotion, and there were plans for the future, and they obviously had a lot of confidence in this fellow, and it all sounded very, very positive. But I noticed, being a good melancholic, sanguine melancholic actually, he slid over that section of the conversation very, very quickly. And I dragged him back to it, and I said, you need to just pause and actually hear what you've just said to me and the positives that are contained in that. And he kind of acknowledged it and then quickly again took I had to do that 2 or 3 times and actually say, let it register. Now, if you've got somebody to do that for you, that's great. But you're going to have to try and catch yourself with those thought patterns, with those terms, phrases that, just give the game away as to how negative you are and begin to question it.
Yeah, there is a sense of having to put some work in,
Yes.
isn't there? To really understand yourself.
Yes. And
so, how important then is it to have, a strong or good sense of self-worth? Because obviously we can see that it creates depression. What else does it do in our lives, if there is this negative, low view of yourself?
Well, it becomes a vicious circle in a number of areas within the melancholic temperament. So, for example, we can say of the melancholic that they have this wonderful gift of sensitivity. The phlegmatic has their own version. We call it tenderness. But that sensitivity can be used positively or negatively. And you remember when we looked at the melancholic earlier on in a podcast, we said one of the keys for them is who are they sensitive to? Is it to themselves or to others? So, for example, somebody might say something and it might even be a compliment, but it's possible for the melancholic, if their whole paradigm is negative towards themselves, to distort and interpret that statement that was made very subjectively, so that what they actually hear is the opposite of the positive that was said. So what the whole thing kind of reinforces itself, and instead of the person being wise and objective, which a melancholic can be, they become very subjective and make it about them and a negative. Why is this person always on at me? Why are they always picking me up about something? Why are they criticizing me all the time? Whereas the person who they see as criticizing them has seen such enormous potential that they're trying to train them and help them and get the best out of them. It's a massive compliment, but all they hear is the negatives.
So you keep mentioning just the melancholic with depression and these low self-worth issues. What happens with the phlegmatic? Are these people immune to feeling depression?
I tend to use the word collapse when it comes to a phlegmatic. And the reason I use that word is because the question that a phlegmatic comes into this world with is, how solid am I? How substantial am I? It's quite a hard feeling to describe, but they feel very wispy almost, very ethereal and not solid. And that is why they can be so defensive and protective of themselves. And that can lead to all sorts of issues. Now, if they come under enough pressure, or as with the melancholic, if they're not connected with, so that they end up devaluing themselves, then the answer is, I'm not solid. There isn't much to me at all. I think the nearest I can describe it as, it would be like standing on a beach, that you were feeling was very solid, and you were looking out, beautiful sun and sea and sky and everything. And then all of a sudden you become aware that your feet are beginning to sink into the sands. And what you thought was quite solid is beginning to swallow your feet and your ankles and your legs up. Now, that obviously would be pretty horrific, the quicksand experience. But at some level, that's what a phlegmatic can feel, that horrible gaping hole within. Now, there's an awful lot we could say about that and how you counter that. And perhaps that would be, well, it can be for a future podcast to perhaps look at the place of anxiety and the phlegmatic. There's some very useful insights there. If you went to the doctor, say a phlegmatic with anxiety, some would prescribe you for anxiety. But it's also possible that it may just be put under that general heading of depression. And that's kind of understandable. But if you can get the different feel of what's behind the melancholic clinical depression and what I would call a phlegmatic collapse, and you can see why I'm not making a judgment when I use that term, because it really does feel like life has become so unsubstantial, and internally it feels like there's not enough to support you and enable you to stand tall and strong in tough situations. So you're getting swallowed up almost on the inside, and it's like falling into a deep pit on the inside. So the end result looks the same, but if you're going to really help those two very different people, it is important to understand what's really going on inside them.
So to make this a bit more personal then, to me, I'm deeply melancholic, but I very much relate more to when you mention the word anxiety. That's something that I feel like it's been one of my personal battles or, journeys of growth.
Yes.
When you talk about depression, I don't relate to it as much as anxiety. Why would that be? Being a melancholic, I would think I'd be more of, leaning towards depression.
Yes. I think you have learnt to handle life and yourself in such a way that you have stopped yourself from going down the depression road. You could have gone down that road. Now, I know you well enough to know that you're very creative. And you may recall when we talked about the melancholic specifically a while ago in the earlier podcast, we said one of the key ways for a melancholic to help themselves is to find at least one thing that they enjoy being creative in and to get on and do that. And so I think you've done that. I do think as a Christian lady, you have had a kind of safety net, really, that has stopped you falling below a certain point and into depression. Now, that's not meant negatively for any Christians that have struggled with depression. I understand what I'm saying here, but I think you're a positive enough person, both in the Lord and with your sanguine temperament, that you've been able to say, okay, there is no point me letting myself go down that road today. What can I do? How can I be positive? What does the Lord want me to do in today? So where you've found yourself kind of caught is almost between the pull of the melancholic, sometimes negatively, which could have taken you towards depression, but also the proper use of the melancholic, the strength of the sanguine, your relationship with the Lord. So it's kind of kept you a bit in the middle of the sanguine and the melancholic. And in its own way, that can also be quite unsettling because there's probably times where you just haven't been sure what's going on, but you've been determined to not slip down the slippery slope.
I definitely think, when you mention the sanguine, just with all the, the very positive, qualities, it definitely does help me, I guess, steer away from, falling into any kind of depressive pit. But I'm very interested to find out more about anxiety, because that's something I can relate with very much. And so shall we have you on next time to chat more in depth about that?
Sounds good. I'll be very happy to do that. And it's been lovely being with you today.